Welcome to another episode of my Wake Up Call. This is the podcast where I speak to people that I get to know a little bit. On a rare occasion, probably in less than two handfuls, I have people back for a second time. And this is one of those rare occasions because I have Stephen Kotler back to join us. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a returning guest. He's a New York Times best-selling author, and his most recent book is Gnar Country, Growing Old, Staying Rad. That's Gnar, and he's going to dive into that. He's an award-winning journalist, the executive director of the Flow Research Collective. He's one of the world's leading experts on human performance. He's the author of 9 bestsellers out of 13 books total, including, and you've probably heard these, you shouldn't have just heard them, you should have read them, for God's sakes. The Art of Impossible, The Future is Faster Than You Think, Stealing Fire, The Rise of Superman, Bold and Abundance. His work's been nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes, translated into 40 languages, and he's appeared everywhere. The New York Times Magazine, Wired, Atlantic Monthly, Time, Harvard Business Review. He's also the co-host of the Flow Research Collective Radio, which is a top 10 iTunes science podcast. Also, there's a very humane side of him because along with his wife, author Joy Nicholson, they're the co-founder of the Rancho de Chihuahua Hospice, which is a special needs dog sanctuary. But we want to talk about your book, although I would love to hear about that too, because we've had dogs for 45 years and they're all buried in our backyard. So talk to us, Stephen.
So a little bit of backstory around Gnar Country. The book is about peak performance aging and high level. First of all, let's just define a few terms. What do I mean by peak performance? What do I mean by peak performance aging? And then I'll tell you a little bit more about the book. The work we do at the Flow Research Collective, where we study the neurobiology of peak human performance, we look at what goes on in the brain and the body when humans are performing at their best. We sort of define peak performance as nothing more, nothing less than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. Peak performance aging is getting our biology to work for us rather than against us when applied to the challenges and opportunity of aging. So simple definition of terms. More specifically, the book looks at, so if you're in and around our age, you grew up with a traditional view of aging. And I like to call that the long, slow rot theory. And this is like the dominant theory of aging in the 20th century, right? It's the idea that all of our mental skills and all of our physical skills erode over time, and there's nothing we can do to stop the slide. And that was entirely true for the whole of the 20th century up until like the middle 1990s. And starting then and speeding up over the past 25 years, almost everything we thought we knew about aging got flipped on its head. And one of the big ones, which the book really focuses on, all the old things that we used to think declined over time, all those old skills, we now know they're all use it or lose it skills. So if you never stop training these skills and working on these skills, you get to hang on to them and even amplify them far later than anybody thought possible. Or that was the theory, right? Most of this stuff was done in a lab, and it was true on paper, and it was true in laboratory studies, but nobody had really taken these ideas into the wild and run a really true hardcore experiment with them. So a lot of the ideas in peak performance aging sort of take the notion that you can't teach an old dog new tricks and turn it on its head and say, hey, wait a minute, old dogs should be better at learning certain kind of tricks than younger dogs. To test all of this, I decided to see if I could teach myself how to park ski in my 50s. Now, park skiing, it's the discipline of skiing, involves doing tricks off jumps, on wall rides and boxes and rails. It's very acrobatic and it's really dangerous. And most people tell you, if you haven't learned by the time you're 30, don't bother. It's very, very difficult. By the time you get to 40, 45, it's downright impossible. And once you're over 50, they just think you're crazy. But on paper, there was nothing crazy about the idea. So I actually tested it. I made a list of 20. I had 0 experience as a park skier, none. I could ski, but I never been in a terrain park, really didn't know what I was doing. Made a list of 20 tricks that covered sort of the stretch between 0 and intermediate, and figured, okay, if it takes 5 years, it takes 5 years, whatever. I have this new learning formula. I'm just going to try. And it took under a season. In fact, I've never learned anything as fast as I sort of learned how to park ski. That was incredible. my ski partner, 20 years younger than me, he's actually a former sponsored professional athlete who retired, had a family, career, came back to the sport with me using the same protocol just to see. He got farther in a single season than he's ever gotten. We went, okay, this is sexy, but this is just the world's coolest pilot study, right? We haven't really done anything yet. We came back the next year, same protocol. We took 70 and older adults, ages 29 to 68. So huge, like 40-year swatch of people. Most of them were just intermediate skiers or snowboarders, so not super skilled athletes, just intermediates. Same protocol, 4 days on the mountain. We got them all leveled up. And we can talk about the protocol and what we did later on, but the point was the protocol worked really remarkably well. And we've since, by the way, stripped out the action sports because not everybody is an action sport athlete and wants to learn how to park ski or whatever, and run it as a peak performance aging training with, and I think we put over 500 or 600 people through the training. And it's been very effective that way. So we've gotten to the point where we've got good data. We like what we're learning. We like where we're going. And but that's the story of the experiments is essentially the story told in Gnar Country. And it's an adventure story more than it's anything else. And the final thing I'll tell you, it's an event. And the reason it is, like, if you've read a bunch of my other books, a lot of them read like fun textbooks in a sense. This book is about applied peak performance. So if you go to The Art of Impossible, it's a book about the neurobiology of peak human performance. There's some application in there, but the truth of the matter is application is sort of a day-to-day thing. You got to see somebody going at a hard problem day in, over and over and over and over again. And in fact, in books on peak performance, nobody had ever tried to do that, because it can be really, if you do it wrong, it's boring as hell, right? Like, you're just like, what am I doing? I'm reading a diary of some guy trying to learn this thing, or some gal. And so the book was sort of complicated to write from that perspective, but I think it's the first book that gives you a really deep look at, like, what does applied peak performance look like? What does applied peak performance aging look like? All those things are folded in. So that's not super quick and dirty, but that's an overview of Gnar Country and what the book's about.
Well, obviously, my listeners and I want you to unpack applied peak performance. Here's a term that you might find useful. Have you ever heard of the term sense of coherence by Aaron Antonovsky?
No.
Sense of coherence says that when something is complicated or complex and confusing, if you can make it understandable, it becomes manageable. And if it's something that's meaningful to you, you have a sense of coherence. So with that framework, if you can dig in and make applied peak performance understandable so that people can grasp it and be and cause them to be curious, I need to find out more about this. Have at that if you can.
Okay. So let me start with a concept, and then let me move into the kind of simplest definition of peak performance aging. I'll give you a sentence. I'll give you it summed up, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. But it's a good frame up. Thanks, Mark. So I want to start with the work I do. And so what am I doing in peak performance aging in the first place? And I work on flow. And so when you talk about peak performance and applied peak performance, what is flow is a good place to start here. Flow is an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. That's the technical scientific definition. More specifically, it's any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. We get so focused on the task at hand, everything else just starts to melt away and disappear. Sense of self, self-consciousness, the voice in your head, your inner critic, they diminish, get really quiet. Time passes strangely. Usually you just get so sucked into what you're doing that a couple hours go by and feels like 5 minutes passed, right? And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. And this is not an exaggeration. I'm just going to go through some rough numbers. And this is work done all over the world by labs everywhere. I'll give you some of the data. McKinsey, business consultancy, took a look at top executives in flow and said, how much more productive and motivated are they? The average after a 10-year study was 500% more productive. That's a huge step function worth of change. And if you hear a number that gaudy, you should immediately be suspicious. except it's in line with all the other things. The Department of Defense looked at how much faster soldiers learn in flow than out of flow, 240 to 500% faster than normal. At the Flow Research Collective, at Harvard, at the University of Sydney in Australia, we've all looked at creativity is amplified in flow and innovation is amplified. How much? 400 to 700%. Strength goes up, stamina goes up, fast twitch muscle response goes up on the physical side, pattern recognition, empathy, wisdom, the list goes on. We are hardwired for peak performance, all human beings, and flow is how we do it. So when we talk about applied peak performance, big picture, simple terms, we're just talking about how do you get more flow in your life? How do you get into the state? Where does it come from? How do we get more of it? Now, I want to give you a bit of additional information about flow and aging, and then I'm going to give you the sentence. So flow is not just peak performance, it also, and this is something that has been discovered over the past 20 years by a lot of different people. I've worked on it, but a lot of other people have contributed as well. So it's not just my work or our work at the Flow Research Collective. But so the first thing you need to know is as we move into flow, there's a global release of a chemical called nitrous oxide. It's literally a gases signaling molecules everywhere in your body. If you've ever gone to the gym, you work out for about 20 minutes, gets quiet upstairs and your lungs open up. We've all had that experience working out. That's nitric oxide. And what it's doing is, besides opening up your lungs and getting it quiet upstairs, it flushes stress hormones out of your system. Flow, this happens right at the beginning of flow, and it's a very big nitrous oxide reaction. So it resets the nervous system to zero, pushes all the stress hormones out of your system. That's really, it's important just in general, quality of life, happiness, well-being, all that stuff. But there are 9 known causes of aging. All of them have one thing in common, which is stress and inflammation in the body. They're all caused by inflammation in the body. Inflammation in the body is caused by stress. Anything that fights stress is a very potent anti-aging tool. So that's the first thing you need to know about flow. Second thing you need to know about flow is it's the best feeling we have on earth. When psychologists define happiness, flow is baked into the definitions at this point. It underpins well-being, life satisfaction, overall meaning, purpose, all of these things. Flow is baked into, and whenever we feel very positive emotions, this is Barbara Friedrichsen's work out of the University of North Carolina, we get it. Not only does it just boost our mood, it boosts our immune system. So the most positive emotions available to humans are a sense of mastery and control. Those are our 2 favorite feelings, and they actually play more of a role in peak performance aging. Anything that generates sensations of mastery and control for reasons that we'll get to, really important for peak performance aging. But there are 2 favorite feelings. Whenever we get them, it amplifies the production of T cells. These are the cells that fight disease in the body, and natural killer cells. These are the cells that target tumors and other sick cells. So if you've got cancer and you want to fight cancer, what you're looking for are natural killer cells in your body. So flow can amplify the production of natural killer cells as well. So these are 2 really big sort of peak performance aging things that happen with flow. The way I always describe it is flow doesn't just make, a life worth living. It makes a whole lot more life worth living. So my work on flow sits sort of in the middle of peak performance aging. So one thing led to another. Now, flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. You want more flow in your life, these triggers are your toolkit. Let me give you peak performance aging in a sentence. It's gonna take a little while to define some of these terms. They're simple, but I'm gonna pack them all together so get it in a sentence. But the first thing to know, high level view, most of these terms do double duty as flow triggers. So this is a formula for peak performance aging. We'll talk about why, but it's also really a formula for flow, for generating way more flow in your life. So peak performance aging in a single sentence. If you want to rock till you drop, right? You want to kick ass till we kick the bucket. You want to regularly engage in challenging, creative, and social activities that demand dynamic, deliberate play and take place in novel outdoor environments. Now, let me unpack all those terms for you. Simple sentence, right? You want to peak performance aging. You want to regularly engage in challenging and creative social activities that demand dynamic, deliberate play and take place in novel outdoor environments. So let's unpack that. What does that mean? This is sort of what's at the center of Gnar Country. Before I unpack that, let me point one thing out. If you are paying attention to the peak performance aging space or the longevity space or the anti-aging space or any of these things, you'll hear a lot about biohacking technologies for peak performance aging, this kind of substance, this kind of medicine, this kind of diet, this kind of cold plunge, hot treatment, blah, 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 inject peptides, do all. And I'm not saying those things are bad, but I want you to notice that everything that was in my sentence, none of those things are a pharmacological intervention. None of those things have a price tag on them. They're not sponsored by anybody. They're available to all of us. They're actually psychological triggers that produce neurobiological reactions. And we have literally 60 years of incredibly good science that says you want to live a longer, healthier, happier life. These are the things to pay the most attention to. This is what we know. Everything else, all the sexy things we're hearing about, these are cutting edge medicines that 20 years from now, they may work or they won't work. But historically, if you look at the batting average of longevity technology and anti-aging medicine, it's 10 to 15% accurate and the rest is wrong, right? That's what we've done. Now it's a new field and it's emerging and it's getting more rigorous. So maybe that will come up. But the stuff I'm talking about has 6 years of research and we know it's 100%. So let's go back to what I'm talking about. Challenging creative and social activities. So flow states have triggers. The most common one is known as the challenge skills balance. Flow follows focus. We get the most flow when the challenge of the task at hand slightly exceeds our skill set, because that's what maximizes attention. When the challenge is slightly outside of our skill set, we're stretching but not snapping. We're curious. We're interested. We're into it. That maximizes focus. If you speak physiology, this is the Erskine-Dobson curve. If you speak psychology, it's the flow channel. But it's the same. It's the same thing. And so, challenging activities in this sentence, right outside the challenge skills sweet spot, are meant to generate flow. A, and B, we know from study after study after study, and Gene Cohn, the founder of the National Institute of Aging, did some of the early work on this, but it's been redone and redone. Adults who regularly engage in challenging activities do far better than those that don't. It's why, if you want to peak performance aging in a single sentence, don't retire, right? Flat out, most experts will tell you don't retire, and it's because of the challenge of work, right? So creative activities, this is the second thing. Why would you need creative activities? So Gene Cohn, same guy we just talked about, made a wild discovery. So he discovered that as we enter our 50s, there are profound and positive changes in how the brain processes information. If we get it right, we get access to whole new levels of intelligence, creativity, empathy, and wisdom. This is literally neurobiological because it changes in the brain, but it's not automatic. We need to learn how to think creatively. The act of learning how to think creatively, engaging in any kind of creative activity. This could be learning how to draw, play music, dance, write, doesn't matter. Take your pick. Engaging these kinds of creative activities unlock these sort of cognitive superpowers of aging. And these are some, when I said earlier, an old dog is better at learning new tricks than younger dogs, it's because of this. You're literally gaining access to whole new levels of intelligence and creativity and wisdom over 50 if you engage in creative activities. That's what unlocks it. And to bonus, creativity. When we link ideas together, that's pattern recognition. That's a flow trigger. It does double duty. So when ideas get linked together, automatically causes the brain to release a neurochemical called dopamine. We've heard of it. It's a pleasure chemical. It's a reward chemical. One of the things it does is it drives focus. I said flow follows focus. That's how all the triggers work. Some of them work by driving dopamine into our system because it drives. Think about when you're excited and you're happy, you're just paying attention to whatever's in front of you and you're not working hard to do it, right? You get focused for free. That's sort of what we're talking about with these flow triggers. That's what you get from creative activities. Social activities, we know from 60 years of studies on the elderly that one of the single most important things you can do to preserve cognitive function and physical health is maintain a robust social life. It really, really matters. And it matters on a lot of levels. But the average research says that those of us with good, tight, close relationships, people around us who love us, and most importantly, cross-generational friendships, right? Not just, I know people my own age, but I know people all ages. If you can maintain that kind of social life, you can get about an extra 7 to 10 years of healthy longevity. So that's challenging, creative, and social, right? That's part A. Part B is dynamic, deliberate play. challenging, creative, and social activities that demand dynamic, deliberate play. So what do those words mean? Those are the confusing words. Dynamic is actually a really simple word for 5 different physical skills. I said at the start of this are there's your use it or lose it skills. On the physical side of that equation, strength, stamina, agility, balance, and flexibility, the 5 skills that matter most. And the World Health Organization has very specific guidelines for peak performance aging. You want to engage in 150 to 300 minutes of vigorous aerobic activity every week, 2 strength training days and 3 balance, flexibility, and agility days. Or you find a single dynamic activity that trains all of those skills at once. So what's a dynamic activity? Skiing, the sport I chose, very dynamic. Snowboarding, most of the action sports, because they combine strength, stamina. But tennis also is great. Badminton is great. In fact, if you look, Mayo Clinic did this great study where they wanted to know what are the physical activities that correlate with the longest longevity. And they started with you join a health club, right? You've been sedentary, you join a health club. Well, after 20 years of data, you get an extra 1.5 years of life for joining your health club and working out. If you start running, it's about 3 years. Swimming's 3.5 years. Soccer will get you about 5 or 6 years, possibly because it's got a social component. But tennis and badminton are the 2 best sports they tested. And it has to do with fast twitch muscle response and hand-eye coordination and strength, stamina, all that other stuff. It trains up all those skills. But here's the final bonus around dynamic activities. If you want to make print, we've all heard exercise is good for the brain, but not all exercise was created equal, and dynamic activities work the best. When the brain has to coordinate like agility with strength and stamina, it actually amplifies 2 big words, angiogenesis and neurogenesis. So if you want to preserve brain function, you will need new neurons. You need the brain to create new neurons and then turn those into new neural networks. Neurogenesis is the birth of new neurons. Angiogenesis is the birth of new blood vessels that get oxygen to those neurons and keep them alive. Dynamic motion boosts both. So you get all the physical benefits and you get these brain benefits. Deliberate play, what is deliberate play and why is it there? You want to preserve cognitive function, lifelong learning is what matters the most. And what really matters is wisdom and expertise. And it's because the most vulnerable area to cognitive decline is the prefrontal cortex, or the part of your brain that's behind your forehead, most recent part of the brain, evolutionarily speaking, most vulnerable to cognitive decline. How do you preserve the prefrontal cortex? You create wildly diverse neural networks with lots of redundancy across the prefrontal cortex. What are the 2 biggest ones you could produce there? Expertise and wisdom. So when we gain expertise, which is, think of it like skills writ large, right? And wisdom is just interpersonal skills, emotional intelligence writ large. That's sort of the difference. Both of those produce these really neuroprotective networks in the prefrontal cortex. So how do you gain wisdom and expertise? Deliberate practice was the old idea. That's Anders Ericsson's 10,000 hours. Do the same thing you did before, a little bit of improvement. You've probably heard this before. Turns out deliberate practice is good, but even Anders Ericsson said, hey, it's good for if you want to learn how to play the violin or be a math genius, this kind of work is great. But it turns out deliberate play is better than deliberate practice. Deliberate play is if repetition with improvisation. You do what you did before, and then you improvise a little bit in a playful fashion on top of it. This amplifies learning and memory more than regular deliberate practice. So you get more expertise, you get more wisdom. So that's the dynamic deliberate play aspect. Novel outdoor environments. So novelty is a flow trigger. So that's one of the benefits there. And the other is that I said that anything that fights stress is an anti-aging technology. We know if you go into nature, time in nature produces serotonin and lowers stress levels significantly. So that's one of the reasons you're going into nature. And the last reason is the human brain evolved to do a very specific thing. It wants to remember where you were whenever something emotionally charged happens. And it has very specific software for that. It lives in a place called the hippocampus. The hippocampus does long-term memory, but it also does place. It's got grid cells and place cells. And it's because we were hunter-gatherers. So like remembering where is the watering hole? or the ripe fruit tree, or the cave where that saber-toothed tiger lived. This is fundamental survival, so the brain is built to do it, which is why most neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, come out of the hippocampus. So if you want to preserve cognitive function, you want to use our biology the way it's designed to be used, that means you want to have novel experiences in novel outdoor environments. So you put all these things together. Sorry, I just talked for another 10 minutes, but you asked for a simple, it's simple. It's just, it's complicated underneath because you want to define the terms, but the idea is fairly straightforward because everybody can participate. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
I want to hit you with something, and it goes back to Rancho de Chihuahua. I come from the emo side of the thing, the empathy, that kind of thing. Done house calls to dying patients, tried to help them make peace with their lives, peace with their mistakes. And our family is put down 6 dogs. They died, and we've gone as a family, when it happens and the life goes out of the eyes. And when you're driving to the vet and you're holding the dog and the dog doesn't really know, the dog looks at you into your eyes. And I think you know this. And it's not exactly flow, but the intimacy in the family when you're there in the room and you're looking at each other and you're just sobbing. It's not flow, but it's something precious. It's something, just even describing it to you, it's precious. And there's something, maybe it's part of wisdom. It's like, wow, this is not just a sad moment. It's really a moment to connect and to stop the busyness in our lives. And we're here and we're saying goodbye to Isabella or Lulu. And I just wanted to share that with you, given what you and your wife co-founded, because there's something going on. I'm not sure if it's flow, but there's a real intimate moment, and it just feels so healthy that we're doing it together. And I just wanted to throw that at you because to see what you thought. It feels like it crosses over a little bit into wisdom, in that this is a really important event that we're sharing. So any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Mark, that's a hard one. So Rancho de Chihuahua, we've done this work for a couple of decades now.
Mm-hmm.
Nearly 800 dogs have passed through our facility.
Mm-hmm.
So we do hospice care predominantly, and that's our specialty. Now, there is a lot of my early work in peak performance aging it came out of flow, but it started with dogs. We developed a healing protocol. So there's a movement in pet longevity and canine longevity to double canine lifespans. And there's really high-end stuff, synthetic biology, et cetera, end-to-one drugs. And then there's really sort of like more low-end stuff. We're part of that. We do diet, nutrition, some really simple evolutionary biology things. We're very successful. We can get our dogs on average live 3 to 5 years longer than they should. We're very good at this. And it turns out that dogs, we experiment on dogs often, which is a shame, but one of the reasons we do it is because their immune systems they're much like humans, right? So we started looking at, hey, wow, this stuff is really working for the dogs. What are we doing? Would it work for humans? And that was one of the places the book came from. That's not an answer to your question. The answer to your question is, I have this very strange perspective, because we've loved all 8. We live family style with our dogs, so that means all of them have passed through our facility. They've been part of our family. I know terrible things about death. When you've lost 800, right? You learn things about death that people shouldn't learn out of multiples. Like, I can tell you that I think grief is an oscillatory wave in the brain that lasts about 3 days. Extreme grief. They used to treat it as a mental illness in the 1800s, and you're just crazy, right? You can't make good decisions. And I've noticed there's a 3-day cycle for that, and that, so things that you shouldn't really learn, I've had to learn because this is part of the work we do. But So that's what I think when I hear you say that, which is not to say that, like, do I think it's a sacred moment? Yes. I mean, sometimes it can be sometimes if it goes well, it's a sacred moment. I've seen it not go well. And that's, awful in a million different ways. But it one of our promises to the animals in our care is that you won't die alone. And that's right. And that to me is part of the sacred bond. Like we will do stuff to extend life, but we don't do extreme measures. We don't do $100,000 surgeries because you can't, we do volume, like you couldn't do it anyways, but it's a very good death that is really important to us, a high quality death, painless, and all that stuff. And that's it's a gift, and but it takes something from you each time. It takes something from you.
Yeah, I remember because I've done a fair amount of death and dying work, suicide prevention, and on several occasions, I've watched when I was in the room when they were hooking up a 90-something person to a morphine drip, and the wife was there, and on a number of occasions, and the husband was kind of gone, and what would happen is as they're putting the drip in, and she's touching the back of his hand with the back of her hand, and she's saying, just breathe through your nose and the pain will go away. As soon as her hand touched the back of his hand, he totally relaxed before the morphine took effect.
Well, sure.
And so, I mean, it goes back to
touch is oxytocin and endorphins.
Totally, yeah.
And I don't know if you've ever been in extreme pain. So I've been in a number of accidents on mountains, and they'll get you down the mountain, and that's a violent process. Like, whatever you think, if you see a helicopter lift down a mountain or a ride down on a sled down a mountain when you're skiing is unbelievably violent and painful. And then you'll get into the emergency room and somebody will come in and touch you. And oh my God, is it a side, like, yeah, of course, because you're getting the same. I mean, you're getting endorphins, it's not to say that the morphine isn't important, it is, but social contact gives you a lot of those same drugs. Right. So does play, by the way. I mean, play, one of the reasons play is such a powerful tool is you don't just get dopamine from play, like as a reward chemical, you also get endorphins, and which is the same thing. That's an opiate. That's the brain's own opiate. And just to give you an idea, so people understand what we're talking about, and this doesn't sound like a miracle, there's 20 different endorphins in the brain. The most common one is 100 times more potent than medical morphine. So these are our internal versions are very strong painkillers, and you can certainly get very big results. We see it in the dogs all the time, because one of the things that we do is we'll do like enforced petting sessions where every dog that in our care gets at least 5 to 8 minutes of cuddling every day, and physical affection is because that's how long it takes to get a dose of oxytocin and endorphins into their system. And if you're doing hospice care, that's just good hospice care. That's just smart elder care management with humans or with animals.
Let me ask you, when you're talking at the speed with which you speak, I mean, you're so smart. What is the chemical that's going on in your frame? Because one of the things I teach in listening around the world, and you have a lot of information to share. I can feel the momentum. You're a little bit of a momentum junkie. It feels great. There's bursts of dopamine. There's bursts of it's wonderful. One of the things I try to encourage out in the world is try to notice the difference between talking over, at, to, or with, and be able to do all 4 of them appropriately for the circumstance. And when you're talking with people, it's much more you're listening receptively, not even responsibly. You're just taking in, and they're feeling somewhere between understood and felt, and they relax. That's what I did with suicidal people. None of them killed themselves in 30 years. So when you're going bump, 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 what's the chemical that's going on in your head?
Kumar, you got to understand, before we got on the air, you asked me to do your podcast. You said, I'm going to set you up. I want you to talk at length. So I'm not like, this is not about listening. This is about performing. You asked me to do a thing for your audience, and I'm doing a thing for your audience. Active listening is the complete almost inverse, right? I'm not thinking about active listening. I'm listening to exactly what you have to say without thinking about what I'm going to say next or what I said before. It's fully present. Chemicals underneath both of those. It's an interesting question. Norepinephrine underpins everything from curiosity to anxiety. There's probably a little bit of dopamine. And you also should understand there are 128 or something different neurochemicals, right? Like, I'm just talking about the big reward chemicals, but there's, of course, glutamate, which runs the brain every time you're awake and alert. And if I'm inhibiting, like, suddenly maybe the voice in my head wants to swear, and this is an appropriate thing, so I want to inhibit that behavior. That's GABA, right? Which allows you to inhibit behavior in the brain. So there's no one simple sort of answer to this. Usually, so sometimes, like, so for example, if you've ever listened to somebody who's done cocaine, right? They talk very, very quickly like I talk, but they don't tend to make a ton of sense. They tend to go in circles. That'll be dopamine. Like, that's just dopamine, and it'll fire up pattern recognition circuits. And so everything they're saying sounds super interesting to themselves, but it's sort of disjointed. So I don't know how much of mine would be dopamine or norepinephrine, or the fact that, like, this is like, I'm here to talk about my book. We're doing a thing together, right? And that's sort of like a performative thing where it's not, I'm doing it. It's more about working and just tight focus. So that could be acetylcholine. It's hard to say. I don't. It's a tough question from a neurobiological standpoint. I don't 100% know.
I know, and I love the way you were talking, because you were speaking in real time. It wasn't any pat answers. You were making sense, and even making more sense the more you spoke. And there was a linear connection between the sense you were making. I mean, there was beginning, middle, ends of the points you were making. And so, like, you're right, it wasn't cocaine speak at all. And I'm almost thinking of people, with ADD, and they take Adderall, and Adderall seems to speed up, a slow brain so they can pay attention, so they don't check out, because a lot of ADD is your brain is slow and you don't make enough connections. And so you have to increase the resting idle of it with these stimulants so that you can slow down and focus. Otherwise, you're responding to the world, not from your brain, but from, a lower thing. But you're a fascinating communicator, and I didn't mean to do a gotcha with you, Stephen. I didn't say you had a lot to share, but we're talking about flow, we're talking about energy, and I was just curious if, and I think you answered it. You said, well, there's a bunch of things probably going on in my mind, and then you smile and say, hopefully it's not cocaine. I think
I mean,
you're going.
Mark, you also have to understand that this is just a really honest answer because we're going down this rabbit hole, but everything I like, when I go out on tour on a book tour, the first thing I do is I write a frequently asked questions. Every question that I get asked for the first 20 to 40 interviews gets written down, and I have an answer for it, and I practice the answer for it. I don't like, I'm being given the gift of other people's attention for a very little bit of time. You know what I mean? I respect that and don't want to squander that. So I script things, I practice things, I know what I want to say. And if it comes off natural, that's fantastic. But I work, there's a lot of hard work underneath that sort of thing. Some people I've worked with people who can just walk into any room and just go, and that's fine. I don't work that way. I like to really, I think if you're going to give me the benefit of your time, I'm going to give you the benefit of my respect and really work hard on my answers.
That was so helpful to me, Stephen, because I more often than not, I'm relatively quick on my feet, not as quick as you. I probably could do more preparation. My approach to audiences, I'm always ready, but I'm not necessarily prepared. But I try to tune in quickly to what they're asking and tune in to what they're asking underneath what they're asking. So I will sometimes be able to tune in to the question underneath the question, and then I'll do my best to answer both. But it was helpful what you said, because I need to make a list of the frequently asked questions, and it is a sign of respect if you prepare and give it some thought as opposed to just hoofing it. So thank you.
It's Mark. It's also, I do a lot of television and a lot of radio. Podcast, you have 2 to 5 minutes to answer a question. Radio, you have about 15 to 30 seconds, or the hosts start to get mad as if you've done radio, right? And television, less than 15 seconds. Talk for more than 15 seconds on a TV show, and the host is going to get really, really angry, right? Because it's bad television. It's supposed to move that fast. And it took me 10 years. I got my ass kicked on television for a decade until I figured it out, because it's hard to do. It's a totally separate skill set. People who are good at it, it's a thing. Nobody realizes that they'll watch Sports Center and they just think they're watching like dudes or talking football. And I'm like, no. You have any idea how hard that is to do well. But I just, so when I do frequently asked questions, I have what's my 15-second answer? What's my 30-second answer? What's my 2-minute answer? What's my 10-minute answer? You gave me 10 minutes. You said, tell me about the book, go along. That was how this opened. So I was like, okay, I'll give you a 10-minute answer. Cool.
That is so helpful too, because I do TV, and I'm going to get embarrassed. When they're smiling, they're not happy. When you go on too much, they're smiling and they're saying it's a smile that says,
yeah,
okay,
no,
it's enough already.
Get on the other side of it. Yeah, you don't want to be on the other side of it. And the other thing is, what's funny, this is totally off topic, but like the morning shows, like the stuff that comes to authors with, like, the hosts are bad. Like they're not yet at the top level, so they don't know what they're doing, right? And so try to make sense where your host isn't even making sense, and you're getting 15 seconds to answer a question. I sort of try to train for that. Like, what's the worst case scenario where my host isn't even making sense because they're young and they're still learning what they're doing, and that's how I try to train for it. Because, as I said, if you're going to give me the benefit of your attention, I'd like to do something cool with it if I can. This
is so helpful. I mean, you've helped me in so many ways now, and I'm having flashbacks of the embarrassing moments that I thought weren't embarrassing, but they were.
Oh, they're embarrassing for all of us, though. If you've done this, we've all been embarrassed in public.
Something I will ask authors is, and you've already more than answered it, but it's one of my prepared things. Is I believe listeners and readers are often listening for something that causes them to think, I never would have thought of that ever, and it's relevant to me. So what would be a couple nuggets? And you might say, Mark, this whole show I've been giving nuggets. I mean, pay attention, Mark. But if I were to ask you a couple counterintuitive things that readers will get and say, I never would have looked at it that way, and that's relevant to my life. Can you tee up a few of those?
From Gnar Country, from the new book?
Yep.
So one of them is the book, besides everything else it's doing, there's a little bit of the history of punk rock in there. And if you're not familiar with punk rock, you're now scratching your head going, what the hell, why would you possibly have the history of punk rock in there? And if you don't know what punk was, you probably think it was about sex and anger and funny haircuts and torn clothes and whatever. but punk was a movement that was really about, it was a DIY creativity movement. It was do-it-yourself creativity. And it was like a do-it-yourself hardcore approach to your own personal salvation. And that's really what peak performance aging sort of demands. It's like this DIY creative effort. You can get it done, but you got to sort of be punk about it. You got to be like gritty about it a little bit. And so that's, I think, one thing that's in the book that may be surprising to folks, especially if they don't know much about punk. You'll learn a little bit about along the way. But that's one thing that's in there that's surprising.
And make that relevant. I mean, would it be, geez, I never understood that about punk rock, or what in particular?
Well, I first of all, I don't think most people ever understood that about punk rock. They don't like, punk was a really interesting sort of cultural response to cultural trauma, right? To a sense of powerlessness, disenfranchisement, and disempowerment that an entire generation of youth felt in the 70s, in the early 80s. And it was a reaction against it. And so let me give you a simple example for a very punk thing. Was regular radio stations would never play punk. Standard clubs wouldn't book in punk shows. So we created our own record labels. We created our own magazines to tell people about the record labels. We booked our own tours. It was all DIY every step of the way. And I think that the entrepreneurship that you see today in Silicon Valley and things like that, all of that emerged out of the punk movement. People don't know that anymore, but that's where it all came from. That whole DIY ethic came out of the punk movement. And as far as, applicable today, it's that same sort of, whether it's entrepreneurship or laden like peak performance, it's still got to take that kind of DIY, creative, gritty, pour your whole soul into it effort. And once again, you can get amazing results.
That was a great nugget. I mean, because I didn't know that about punk rock. I knew a little bit about it, but the way you're describing it and the parallels between that and entrepreneurship and the do-it-yourself kind of approach, that really fits. That whole attitude, we're not one way, we're not another way, but maybe we'll just do it our way and see what turns out. So that was great.
Punk was literally about taking whatever anger you felt at whatever injustice in the world, turning it and using it as fuel for creativity. That was what was transformational about it. It was take your anger at the world and use it as fuel for creativity that feeds back into your community and does some good. It was powerful that way and interesting that way. And it for me, it's very much in keeping with like kind of an approach to peak performance aging that I think is important. You've got to get ready about it.
How is punk different or similar to rap?
So that's an interesting question. We're very off topic now, but most people tell you the birth of punk and the birth of rap were roughly the same thing, right? So back in the day, if you listen to the Beastie Boys or Public Enemy or Eric B. and Rakim or Grandmaster Flash or a lot of the early hip hop, early rap, you were also probably listening to punk and new wave, because it wasn't like, I grew up going to punk clubs and it was just as likely that they were playing the Sex Pistols or the Sisters of Mercy or Joy Division as they were the Beastie Boys or Public Enemy or, Two Live Crew or something like that. There wasn't those divisions at the time. Obviously, and I think there was a lot more, even though punk is seen more as a white movement and hip hop or black. I think that was very much from the outside. Inside the communities, everybody crossed color lines. That was one of the things about punk. And even early hip hop is like, the big deal about punk was we didn't care what you looked like. We didn't care who you had sex with. We didn't really even care what you believed in. What we cared about was like kindness and DIY creativity. Those were the values that really, really matter inside the community.
Wow. Can you, without editing, make the connection between that punk experience and your focus on peak performance and kind of where you are? Because what you just described really helped me appreciate just your energy, the focus, the peak performance. Are there connections between that and where you are now?
Are there connections between?
You know, your punk rock interest, punk experience, and the kind of energy of peak performance. There's almost like a not a staccato rhythm, but there's a real energy. There really is like a peak.
It's interesting. So I don't know, Mark. I'll tell you something that's funny. If you listen to Iggy Pop, his early punk star, or Henry Rollins from Black Flag, if you listen to either of those guys talk, myself, we actually have very similar rhythms of communication and communication styles, which is interesting. Somebody else pointed it out to me. They were listening to a Jim Osterberg, a Iggy Pop interview, and they texted me and they were like, you guys have different vocabularies, you're talking about different things, but the diction is the same. And we're both punk rockers from the Midwest, from roughly the same era. He's like a half generation older than I am. But there was a lot of overlay in those communities. And I don't know if it's a punk thing or like I hear it. I've come to believe that like however unique I think I am, it's not true. Cause like when I listen to these guys, I'm like, oh wow, I sound a little bit like them. I'm actually less unique than I thought. I'm of an era and of a time and a place, maybe. So it's nice that you're giving me the compliment of the energy, and maybe it's mine, or maybe it's just of a place and the time, and I can't tell.
Oh yeah, it just. I'm going to be reflecting on this after we stop because it just clicked. I know very little about punk, but something about the energy and the energy with which you communicate. There's something very similar to that, and it's engaging. And
I think the thing that I will tell you that if there's one crossover here, if Gnar Country and the punk movement, I think, they both have a value in common, which is I'm tired of people who are dead before they're dead. Right. And so the book, as much as it was an experiment in peak performance aging, it was pushing back against something that I was seeing in culture, in people, and in people who are decades younger than me. Also, that's the other thing, is I see it in people who are decades younger than me. And I'm not, that's not interesting to me. I'm much more interested in a world where, like, everybody's pouring every single thing they have into their life. I always said that, like, the only thing for sure is we get one shot at this life, right? So, like, that's the only thing we knew. So, and we're going to spend a third of it asleep. So, what we do with the other 2/3 of that equation is the only question that really matters. And so, that's a little punk in sort of its brashness and in your faceness. But that was sort of where the book came from also. It's like, don't be dead before you're dead. It's gonna happen anyways, right? We're gonna get there anyways.
Help me with something. I occasionally work with failure to launch 30-something people, and I don't work with drug addicts or whatever. But what I've discovered and what's been a breakthrough for them is the world has tried to constrict them, tell them what they should be, what they should do. And every time they tried to do something that they wanted to do, the influence of the family or whatever. And so what happened is they caved, and they reached a point where when I've said to them, I think what's happened is you've lost trust and confidence in yourself, and you've lost the courage to fight. And they just start to cry. So it's kind of like there's something about the continual failures or the continual being told not to do something and then giving up on themselves. And what I'm trying to do is give them a little bit of comfort, because they go into the intellectual trying to think it, and their minds are just all over the place. But when I can pierce the pain And when we can put it into words, affective labeling from Matt Lieberman in UCLA, when I say what I think you're communicating is that you've lost trust and confidence in yourself, and you don't have the confidence to fight, and you're stuck. And there's something about that that frees them, because they just start to cry with feeling understood and feeling felt. And I would love any kind of tactics or tools to help work with those people, because I love what you're saying. And I'm bringing it up because these are wonderful people, and they're dead before they're dead. And it's painful to.
So I don't know if I look. So Mark, I always say this: like my company, we train tens of thousands of people every month. We train people in 130 countries. We work globally. We work with everybody you could possibly imagine, right? From companies like Facebook and Accenture and Audi, all the way through just like, mom and dad. I don't coach anybody. I hire the best coaches in the world. I'm not a coach. I rarely give advice in this way. It's not what I do. So this is the caveat before I open my mouth and tell you what I think. I just always want to say, like, I'm not a coach, and there are people who are coaches, and I see what they do, and they're great at this. I'm not. I am great at figuring out the neurobiology of peak human performance and figuring out how to get it to work. Other people are really good at working with other people. I don't have those skills. I'm too much of an introvert and a misanthrope sometimes. But that said, here's what I got for you. The two things that I was thinking about when I was listening to you is, one, I don't think most people understand that it's hard here for everyone. Like, it's hard for everyone. I don't think people understand. Like, I say it all the time, like nobody gets out of here alive. It's painful everywhere. I've met people at every realm of the social economic ladder in every country. I've been around the world a bunch of times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard for everyone across the boards. Thing A. Thing B, I remember once listening to a lecture by a NASA astronaut, and I was listening to this lecture right after I wrote a book with Peter Diamandis, founder of the X Prize, right? Very, very successful human being. Peter's an old dear friend, but I had this really weird experience where I was personally working on an autobiographical thing where I was sort of like writing out my history. Peter and I were working on abundance, and I had decided that we were going to write abundance in his voice. And so I was sort of getting his story, and I knew Peter, I've known him for years, but like, he was telling me his story. So as the same time these two things were happening, I was at Singularity University, which is the university that Peter helped start in Silicon Valley, listening to a NASA astronaut tell his story. And here's the funny thing. The NASA astronaut is telling his story, and he got rejected, I think, 18 years in a row by NASA. 18 letters of recommendation. Like, he'd go through this incredibly grueling apply to be an astronaut program, and they rejected him 18 years in a row. And he had a PhD in this and a PhD in this, and was already, I mean, like, and it's this, story of like getting his ass kicked forever, right? And if you listen to Peter's backstory, it's the same kind of story. If you go to my backstory, like, literally, you can't. More people told me not to. They threw me out in high school. They failed me because my senior project was a collection of poetry that they found morally offensive to my school. So they tried to fail me in high school. They threw me out of my undergraduate writing program in college because I was too disruptive and nobody knew what I was doing. It took me 3 years to get into grad school because nobody wanted to, like, on and on. And I could just go on and on and on and on. It took 11 years to get my first book published. And I'm not an exception. Peter's not an exception. This NASA guy's not an exception. Everybody's got that story. Every successful person you met has gotten their ass kicked over and over and over and over and over again. And the only difference is successful people just don't stop. They just keep going, right? It does, because oftentimes there's no other choice. Nobody was going to give me a job. When I was 23 years old, I had dreadlocks down to the middle of my back, and I had crazy earrings and weird colored hair. And this was the late 80s, and nobody got a job in corporate America looking like that. You might do it today, but not 40 years ago. And I, got my ass kicked forever trying to make a career. Peter got his ass kicked forever trying to build his career. This NASA guy, on and on and on. That's everybody's story. It's hard here for everyone, and everybody who's successful has gotten their ass kicked over and over and over again. In fact, I will tell you this as one of the world's leading experts on peak human performance. Do you know who has the heart? There are two groups of people who are hardest to train in peak performance.
Ooh.
One, people who were really, really, really happy in high school. If you were super popular, super smart, great athlete in high school with lots of friends, it's really hard to train you in peak performance as an adult because you haven't learned the grit skills, and they're really hard to learn in your 40s and 50s, right? So if you didn't grow up getting your butt kicked and you grew up easier, you have a hard time. And the other group, and I always find this funny, is lawyers. Lawyers are like this super successful group of people that you would think, right? And it turns out there's something about the legal profession and the mindset that puts you in that it's a very backwards facing, negative, pessimistic profession. That's a hard obstacle. The mindset optimism piece is very hard. So I find those are the two groups of people that have the toughest time in peak performance, which I find, sort of shocking, because those are not groups of people that you would actually point at and go, they're going to be bad at something. But as a general rule, they're bad at things.
Something, I don't know if you can relate to this, because I've gotten my ass kicked all through life. And one of the things that's helped me most is I realize that I've probably had 500 breakthroughs, positive things, and 90% were preceded by breakdowns and getting my ass kicked. The secret was to not make things worse when I got my ass kicked, because if I made things worse, I might have to apologize to someone. I was embarrassed. I didn't mean it. Or if I would have to apologize to myself. You didn't need to get drunk. You didn't need to do such and such. And so I put myself, I'm a psychiatrist. So whenever I get my ass kicked now, I put myself on a 72-hour hold. I say, don't do anything to make it worse. Don't do anything. Just keep your routines going. And I will tell you, 90% of the time, I have a breakthrough that's sometimes connected to how I got my ass kicked, but most of the time it's not. It's almost like a psychedelic thing where everything falls apart, but instead of messing up my life and then feeling embarrassed about it, it's like it gives me a chance to recalibrate. And then I do. Dots connect spontaneously from all the experiences of my life. And so that has singularly been the most helpful way for me to deal with setbacks and rejection, because I know this is going to make me smarter, stronger, maybe a little bit wiser, and I don't know what it's going to look like. Just don't miss it by doing something stupid that you're embarrassed about.
That's good advice. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'll share an anecdote, and then we need to stop. A friend of mine, he was the CEO of Abbott Medical Optics. They make Blink, and he pulled their top product when it was hurting corneas. And I called him up and I said, Jim, I'm so proud to know you. You pulled the top product without asking anyone. And he said, I'm giddy with excitement. I said, what? He said, I'm really giddy with excitement. I said, you better shut the door. I said, what's going on? He said, mistakes, failures, setbacks, they're inevitable. And everyone in my life has made me smarter, stronger, and wiser. And I know this is going to do the same. I just don't know what it's going to look like. So I'm excited. I thought, wow, what a way to look at life.
It's not a bad way to look at life.
Not a bad way, yeah. So where can people find you, find out more about you?
GnarCountry.com is the book. And by the way, the Crazy Peak Performance Aging Experiment I talked about, we had a National Geographic cameraman follow the group around. So you don't take my word for it. Go to GnarCountry.com and there's videos of the peak performance aging experiments. They're really fun. StephenKotler.com, FlowResearchCollective.com is the company. And for anybody who's interested in training with the Flow Research Collective, want to learn more, go to getmoreflow.com. You can sign up for a sort of free informational interview there. That's me. That's
That's,
Stephen Kotler on Instagram.
this is a second date. I don't think I've had a third date, but I'd love for us to do this again in a year and a half or 2 years and see what the hell you're doing.
Thanks, Mark. Look forward to it.
Thank you. Take care. And thanks to our listeners. And please share this one and please prepare. You show respect for other people by preparing. Don't follow me as a role model. I had breakfast with Larry King for 2 years before the pandemic, and he was always ready and never prepared. But he never hit.
Maybe. So, by the way, I don't know if like people want to take advice from me or Larry King. I might take advice from Larry instead of me. I don't know.
Well, what it was is he never hit people with a gotcha. And so people always felt comfortable. Some people said he was too softball, but the point is he would listen from the point of view of his audience, and his audience, was not super educated. So he knew exactly what his audience would be curious about, and that would inform what he would ask people. And he would never be judgmental or corner them or make them feel stupid. I mean, he had opinions. I mean, we expressed that during breakfast at Nate and Al's in Beverly Hills all the time. But anyway, to be continued. Thank you and good luck with the book.
Mark. Be well.
Take care. Bye.